few days ago, I asked these questions.
What is an audience? When people say you have to know your audience, what does that entail actually?
I got some great answers and some great discussions off app, and I want to take some time to thank everyone who answered me, who facilitated those discussions. I want to give a special shout out to Sarinth, to Cyrenix, and to Kalani, because they were really instrumental in getting me to think about this problem. First, I want to establish some context here. I sprung this question on y'all, and mainly that was because I wanted to get some genuine off-the-cuff answers and see what folks really thought about these questions. The context was a very specific situation that I'm betting most academics and creatives have dealt with. So here's the situation. You're making something, an article, a song, a game, a Type 5 comedy set, a play, a novel. You have to present this thing to an audience. You have never met this audience. You may never have even been to where this audience will meet you. You have only a vague prompt for submission and whatever generalizations you can make for the venue. As a person making something, you are told endlessly to know your audience, especially when it comes to delivering an expressive presentation or artifact. You agree? I agree. That makes complete sense. But here's the issue, right? How do you tool what you make to an audience that you have literally, not figuratively, literally never met and can only make vague generalizations about? Now, before the marketing folks step in and start screaming, this is literally what we do, have you never even heard of focus groups? I'm going to offer a gentle reminder. When you have access to corporate money, to the social proofing that a corporation or an official entity can offer, this makes acquiring something that could be seen as that information, and yeah, I'm qualifying that for a reason, that can make all that a little bit easier. I'm not saying it's easy, just easier. Focus group and A/B testing are still really annoying to do. But to the overwhelming majority of folks who've been shut out of corporate work due to the unemployment crisis, who have had to turn to freelancing and content creation as a means of putting food on the table, the budget for official focus groups is simply non-existent. Additionally, asking folks to report their beliefs based on their preference with no lead up is incredibly fraught and, to be frank, often ignored. As someone who has experience with community management and has seen the failures of things like this, like surveys, like self-reporting, you'd think that asking a community what their preferences are is fairly straightforward. It's in fact not at all. Again, we come back to the question, how does one come to know an audience that one has never met? How does one come to know a group that may not even exist? I have to be clear. There are some pretty big differences between the case of, say, a lone author versus the case of a comedian or stage actor. In some ways, folks who do stage work have it a bit, dare I say, easier. One has more resources at one's disposal, that is to say, immediacy, presence, the ability to feel the energy of the room. There's emergent qualities that come when you're dealing with an audience that is literally right there. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying being a comedian or being on stage is at all easy. It is brutal. But there's an access to audience in those circumstances that can better resemble a living understanding that can be easily pivoted during the performance or made responsive to the immediate circumstances. There's also a deep difference between the case of, say, a content creator who is soloing everything and a member of an extant community who is producing something. There, we don't run into the problem of the scrying the audience, as it were, in the same ways. There's more immediate access to those community norms and desires that can inform the tooling of whatever presentation or artifact that you're producing. It might not be perfect or ideal access, but it's at least some kind of direct observation of what the people involved in that audience may actually want. Even as I'm giving these caveats, the overall problem that I'm gesturing at is still loud and present and accounted for. So let's really dig into that. Metacognition is a highfalutin word that on a basic level can mean thinking about thinking, specifically thinking about your own thoughts. But that's not all it can mean. It can also refer to awareness and monitoring your own expressions and methods according to a particular situation or circumstance. Let me give you an example. If I'm aware that I learn best by trying something out a whole bunch of times rather than reading about it, I'm going to tool my approach to learning according to that knowledge. Likewise, metacognitive behaviors are involved when you're dealing with an audience, whether it's immediate or hypothetical or absent. So for example, right now, while I'm talking about this, I'm thinking about one of my mutuals, Geek the GM, who is also an academic, who has a lot of disciplinary background in metacognition in specific. And I'm wondering if my presentation of the term is actually reflective of an accurate understanding of the concept, or whether I've completely bungled it, mainly because I'm used to the term as it operates within philosophy, and Geek the GM, if I'm not mistaken, is specializing in psychology. I am currently, without directly interacting with Geek the GM, trying to ascertain whether or not he would approve or disapprove of my presentation, and attempting to correct for that using these kinds of insurance or hedging strategies while I'm talking, just in case I bungled it. In that example, I'm engaging in thinking about my own thinking, about Geek the GM's thinking about what I'm saying. That's a lot, but it is illustrative of the sort of predictive activity and strategy that goes into adjusting for audience. It is also illustrative of where things can go really, really wrong, especially in the creation process. Already, some of you may have already identified what's going wrong. Some people might call it overthinking. But the threshold of what counts as careful market research, covering your bases, being authoritative, and overthinking, that's a shifting threshold. It's really hard to tell the difference sometimes, at least for me. It is a deeply hard and error-prone thing to try and second guess what will actually land with an audience. And it's especially hard when the response is silence. The other day, I came across a video on my FYP which compared content creation with throwing darts in a dark room. This isn't a bad metaphor, but it also demonstrates the issue with silence as audience response. Audience silence can, of course, mean rapt attention. It can also mean absolute indifference. It can mean failure on a more fundamental level than even hate comments. I say this as someone who literally built my initial following, pissing Logic bros off for saying that they don't understand the depth and breadth of what Logic actually has to offer. Talking about this silence is also an issue. It can be seen as whining, complaining, some kind of petulant behavior, guilting an audience or something like that. When you talk about silence in this way and it's seen as that, often you get responses that amount to a kind of get good, where if you just need to follow these easy steps to go viral and then everything's going to work out. Never mind what sorts of presumptions and ideas are baked into that process and whether or not they are even compatible with your message. One is thrust privately and often into a position attempting to scry a silence, to embrace the sense of failure even. But even then, there are these prevailing ideas, these prevailing narratives about audience as approval mechanism that just keep popping up, as if audiences were clearly organized along interest and demographic lines that somehow are transparent and perceivable. Heck, you can even open up TikTok Studio or YouTube Studio or what have you, and you'd be like, oh, it appears that the 28 to 45 female American demographic is really responding to my video. And you can say that confidently, and you can try to make that useful information despite knowing, just from common sense and practical experience, how incredibly broad that demographic's interests actually are, and how, and this is important, how they are not homogenous. I'm digressing here. Let's refocus back to the point. Folks offer you have to know your audience as a piece of advice, usually in the valence of critique. Again, as if knowing an audience were easily accessible, easily perceivable, and knowable even when they're absent. As if audiences that are not present in the same room as you somehow followed the same specific norms of evaluation, belief, and consistency according to their interest and their demographic. As someone who has gone through the academic peer review process, as someone who has played on stages, both large and small, as someone who has done this content creation thing for a minute, I can tell you that this idea of homogeneity within demographic, that somehow interest lines and demographic lines have a consistency, have a sameness, all of that is a very pretty lie. Let me say that even more succinctly. The consistency that you get from audience data, like demographics, and even admittedly some focus groups, is only at the level of the most generalized information. If you are incredibly lucky, you'll have some members of that audience tell you a specific issue or a specific compliment. If you are more lucky than God, you'll have an overwhelming number of that audience tell you a particular issue or compliment and give you feedback. More often than not, though, it's arbitrary, even right down to whether or not a person is sitting comfortably, whether they are hungry or tired, whether or not they got in a fight that day. Here's an awful truth. Your future has likely been decided at least once by someone's anger. That sucks, but that's the truth. That's how it is. How does knowing your audience even supposed to control for that? What is this critique even doing at that point? Don't get me wrong, okay? Safeguarding your own content through making it as accessible as you can, that's incredibly crucial. It's something I'll champion every time. But how exactly does one control for whether or not your audience had a bad day or is hungry or sitting uncomfortably? How does knowing your audience through merely imaginative and vague predictive means that are entirely fallible control for externalities like that? It can't. The advice or critique of you have to know your audience is useless in the face of that. Sure, okay. It can be meant as know the particular norms of submission and presentation in that venue, but merely following format guidelines isn't going to guarantee acceptance or even importance. Following a format doesn't guarantee engagement or attention. Following a rule-bound tradition in a craft does not guarantee success. Understanding formats only takes you so far. So what do? I've been long tortured by the idea of an audience, especially by folks who say there is no audience for X, no audience for Y, and people using that as a cudgel. In this especially bizarre, proliferated media age, I found there's an audience for most everything. What about audience discovery? And what about audience generation? Audience discovery is not a matter of carving nature at the joints according to clean demography or interest commitments. It's also not a matter of discovering some mathematical or physical force of audience. It can be understood as a kind of algorithmic selection that is lossy, generalized. It's not really representative of what your content may seem like it would attract. You can think of like the case of periphery demographics if you like. Example, did you know that a lot of boomer bike clubs really like Jethro Tull? You know, Jethro Tull, the British progressive rock band with the lead singer, Ian Anderson, who wears a codpiece and plays flute and sings about unhoused folks and Celtic Reconstructionism. Yeah. But it's also exactly the kind of thing that is almost impossible to predict ahead of time. There's not a terrible amount of control beyond make things often, send it everywhere, quantity over quality, but still make it quality, all that. On the other hand, there's also audience generation, right? this seems to be where the rubber really meets the road. Here, it's not about trying to play darts with the universe in a dark room. Here, it's about actually fostering direct connection with the folks who are engaging or observing your content. This is more than just clickbait titles and solicitations for response. This is about establishing a dialogic and invested relation in someone else and making your content for them. Suddenly, in that kind of dynamic, there's more of a chance, not guaranteed, of course, that there's something there for them and there's something there for you. The problem with that is it does presume that people are aware and have articulated thoughts about their own taste. Of course, the issue with audience generation is that it's slow. It's painstaking. It's still not guaranteed to produce success, and it doesn't seem to have a terrible amount of reach. In other words, a depth strategy, not a breadth strategy. It can also mutate into really strange social transactionalism and turn weirdly toxic. So again, risk is everywhere here. It's not all doom and gloom. Audience discovery methods can get you in front of a lot of eyes and hoping that you can get maybe 1-2 people who might care about what you do. And then you can kick in the audience generation methods that can establish relation making between the observed and the observer, the audience and the creator, such that dialogue and living understanding can be generated, such that trust can be built. Again, none of this seems to capture what the critique of know your audience is pointing at, as if it were some a priori, that is to say, before experience, accessible and perceivable thing. Rather, it seems like the audience discovery and generation methods I just talked about, at least to me, seem like the process by which one comes to know audience in the first place. But note, that can only happen after you've made the thing. You can apply lessons that you might think are generalizable from other contexts. Sure, being pretty can also help, but there are no guarantees here. I'm going to repeat that again. There are no guarantees here. In other words, I'm extremely doubtful that there is a correlation or even a causal relationship between knowing an audience and success. Let's recognize that piece of advice for what it is. Garbage. If it's somehow meant to stand in for another sentence, like, I don't know, a concern about format guidelines, understanding genre and convention, becoming familiar with traditions of craft, okay, cool. But let's say that instead of know your audience. Be specific. Okay? Okay. Cool. Glad we had this talk.